Today I'm going to talk about some of my favorite authors. This is actually the first time on the channel that I've redone a video. I did this video about 4 years ago where I talked about the authors that I'd read most. And it's time to do a redo because I remember when I did that first one, it was 10 or 12 books to get into the top 10 of my most read authors ever. Well, now it takes 16, and there are quite a few differences between this list and that list. So I wanted to talk about my favorite authors. So for every author that I'm going to bring up, I will tell you a little bit about their work, what it is I like about them, and then at the end I'll give you my favorite book by the author as well as a recommendation for maybe an entry point. So if you are interested in checking out any of these authors, I can give you maybe an idea of where to start with them. So as I mentioned, it takes 16 books to get onto this list, and we're going to start with, I had 3 different authors that had 16, so because of that I actually have 11 authors I'm going to talk about today. This first one, I actually wasn't sure whether I was going to include him or not because most of his works were actually published posthumously, but I decided to do so because it is still his writing, even though it wasn't necessarily published while he was alive, and that's J.R.R. Tolkien. Tolkien wrote 4 books in his lifetime, at least published 4 books in his lifetime, but since then, in the decades that followed, his son made his life work, just compiling all of his father's works and published so much of it. And I've read 16 works by Tolkien at this point. And I really love Tolkien. If you don't know Tolkien, you probably have to know Tolkien. If you don't know Tolkien for some reason, Tolkien is considered the father of fantasy. And many of the things that he did in The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit basically set the foundation for the entire genre for decades. There were even just so many authors that just kind of imitated Tolkien to get published. And he created all the tropes and just kind of codified what a lot of the archetypes are within the genre. And he really only wrote 2 stories, The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, but thankfully his son, Christopher Tolkien, has put out a lot of other works of his afterwards. So what I've read, of course, the ones that he published in his lifetime, Silmarillion, Unfinished Tales, The Three Great Tales, and I'm about halfway through the History of Middle-earth, which is 12 volumes of writings that are kind of built the entire world. That's the thing that I love about Tolkien most, is the world building. I still don't feel that he has an equal in the fantasy genre, and that's one aspect that I think hasn't been bettered. You can say other aspects of his style of fantasy have maybe been improved upon in the decades since he's been published, but that's the one kind of the gold standard I feel for world building is still in Tolkien's hands. So my favorite work of Tolkien's, of course, is The Lord of the Rings. If I had to choose one book in that series, I would pick The Fellowship of the Ring as my favorites. And then I would say my entry point for Tolkien, if you haven't read Tolkien before, I would say pick up The Hobbit. It is a prequel to The Lord of the Rings, and while it is a little different in writing style and especially in tone, it's still the best place to enter Middle-earth with The Hobbit. All right, the next author who I've read 16 books is David Eddings. David Eddings is also a fantasy author. You will see a lot of fantasy authors on this list because the fantasy authors write big series, so it's a lot easier to read a lot of their books because of that. Well, Eddings was one of my favorites when I was a kid. And Eddings is very, very traditional fantasy. Most of his works were written in the 80s and 90s. When I was reading him in the 80s, for me, the Belgariad was probably my favorite series for quite some time, probably until I reread The Lord of the Rings and just realized the superiority of that series. But I still have a kind of a fondness in my heart for the Belgariad, as it was one of my favorites as a youth. Now, Eddings is one of those authors that I don't recommend to everybody. Seasoned fantasy readers, I never recommend Eddings because Eddings is very formulaic, he embraces the tropes, and a lot of modern fantasy readers just can't deal with that. And when I say formulaic, that's not insulting to him because Eddings actually published his formula late in life of everything he had to include in his stories, and it's very trope-filled. But I think there's still some greatness, and that's why I still recommend Eddings for anyone who's never read fantasy before. I always recommend the Belgariad because I feel that's when Eddings was at his best, was his first series. And it introduces you to the tropes. I think a lot of times if a modern fantasy reader reads for the first time something in the genre and they read something that's subverting the tropes, they probably are not going to get the same effect as if they really know the tropes and they're ingrained upon, them as a reader. So I do still love the Belgariad and recommend that quite a bit. I've read the Belgariad, the Malorian, the other books in that world, and I read the Elenium as well. And I will say that Eddings kind of, as he came back to that formula again and again and again, he kind of became unreadable for me because it didn't have the depth of character as he did initially. It felt like there was just no invention because he was following this formula. So he's probably not an author that will ever read again, although I've read the 16 books of his. My favorite is the Belgariad. If I had to pick one, I'll probably just pick Pawn of Prophecy because that's where it all starts for me when you meet all of these characters. And then if I were to recommend anything by David Eddings, I would make the same choice. I would pick Pawn of Prophecy, the first book of the Belgariad. All right, the third author that I've read 16 books is Guy Gavriel Kay, who is my favorite author. Kay is also a fantasy author, but he does not do fantasy like anybody else. Kay writes a brand of fantasy that's often explained as historical fiction with a quarter turn to the fantastical. He also tends to write standalones and not series, so he definitely bucks the traditions of the fantasy genre. One of the reasons I love Kay, if you've been on this channel, you've heard me gush about this author quite a bit because he's become my favorite author, is I just love his prose style. I think it's the best in the genre. I also feel that his strong narrative voice just adds a gravitas to his works that other authors lack. And when I read Guy Gavriel Kay, I just feel like I'm reading something that's really important. And no other author in the genre has ever made me feel like that. So Kay has 16 books. Some of them are in a shared universe, but what's really neat about Kay is his settings, is he takes a place in Earth's past and just uses that as inspiration for a story. So he'll pick a place like Renaissance Italy, and he'll pick maybe some characters or some situations and use that as a jumping off point to tell a story. And he often plays fast and loose with the history, but he always changes the name, so it's not a one-for-one comparison. But it does lend to just bringing the setting to life. So whether it's Renaissance Italy, or maybe it's the rule of Emperor Justinian in the Byzantine Empire or the Tang Dynasty, he brings history to life in many ways in his fantasy stories. So my favorite work by Guy Gavriel Kay is A Song for Arbonne. My entry point for people that I usually bring up is The Lines of Al-Rasan, which was my first work of Kay's, and I think it works great. It is actually the first work of 8 of his books are in this Byzantine Empire type of world. It's called Sarantium in this world, the Sarantine Empire, and that's the first book he wrote in that kind of very, very, very loosely connected series of books. So that's my entry point, is The Lines of Al-Rasan by Guy Gavriel Kay. All right, the next two authors, both I've read 17 books by them, starting with Isaac Asimov. So Asimov is considered one of the pillars of science fiction. In fact, I started all three of the three big pillars about the same time: Isaac Asimov, Robert Heinlein, and Arthur C. Clarke. And while I do think that Arthur C. Clarke is probably the most gifted writer, Asimov's the one that I've read the most so far. I just loved Foundation, which is where I started. And I ended up reading all of those books, and then I branched out and read the Empire books, and then I read the robot books, and I've read a few other things as well. And he is an author I will definitely keep exploring. Asimov's one of those writers that it's all about ideas. His writing style is not something that you're going to say is advanced or anything. I've heard it described as journalistic. And his books are pretty short. Characterization's probably not his strength in most of the books, but I love the ideas that he explores, and I do love kind of his vision of this future universe that he paints, especially in those three somewhat interconnected series of Foundation, Empire, and the robot novels. And that's basically the bulk of what I've read. My favorite work of Asimov is probably the entirety of the Foundation series. He wrote an initial trilogy and then 2 sequels and 2 prequels. I'm honestly not sure what would be my favorite, but I do think his writing is best in the prequels, which he wrote last. So I guess I'll say that as my favorite, but I do love the entirety of the Foundation books. My entry point for Asimov, I'm going to give you 2 because I have my personal one and I hear other people that prefer the other one. My personal one is Foundation. go in knowing that, like a lot of science fiction writers of his time, a lot of time these are novels that are short stories that are connected. Foundation is 5 such stories. But the one that I hear a lot of people talk about as a great entry point is I, Robot. I liked Foundation better than the Robot novel, so that's why I picked Foundation. But I, Robot would be a great entry point as well. It's very similar in style in that it's a bunch of connected short stories. But either way, I think both of those are great entry points into the works of Isaac Asimov. Okay, my other author that I've read 17 books is the one that I have the most trouble recommending, even more than Eddings, and that's Haruki Murakami. Murakami is one of those galvanizing authors that it seems like people love Murakami, like me, or they hate Murakami, and it seems like there's very little middle ground with him. And he's one of those authors where you look at Goodreads ratings, and he's got a lot of 3.8s, which is usually kind of a sign that there's a lot of extremes with his books. Well, Murakami is also an author that's hard to just say, this is what this author's all about. Well, Murakami, I always describe him as magical surrealism. I don't know where I first heard that term, but I hear a lot of people banding it around, and I think it's true because it's very contemporary kind of stories, but it's very surreal, the things that he throws in together. And they're often fantastical in nature, but there's still that degree of this is, set in our world, usually in Japan, since he is a Japanese author. But magical surrealism is probably the easiest way to describe Murakami. Or you could just simply say he's weird, because he writes some really, really weird things into his stories. He also often includes some weird things of a pseudo-sexual nature at times, and that turns a lot of readers off. And then there's some of those that very, very push that envelope big time, and I can understand why people would definitely bounce off of his works. So for me, I've read all but like 4 of his works. I haven't read his newest novel and then some of his earlier ones, but I will definitely read everything by Murakami, so his numbers will continue to rise. My favorite is the science fiction kind of novel 1Q84, which is kind of a riff on George Orwell's 1984. It's a big, thick, epic story, and it's my favorite thing by Murakami. Entry point for Murakami. This was hard. I actually went and checked out those Goodreads ratings just to see what other people were thinking about Murakami. And I looked at the highest rated books by him that I've read, and the highest one is The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle, which I don't want to pick that as my entry point for Murakami because it's kind of thick, and I don't know if that would be a great entry point for Murakami. So the second highest book on that Goodreads ranking was Kafka on the Shore, which has a really disturbing subplot, so I would not want to recommend that as an entry point to Murakami. So I picked the third one. The third one is a book called Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World, which has kind of 2 stories running parallel, one set in our world, one set in this magical world, and I think is probably a good entry point to Murakami's works. The one thing I love about Murakami is he just immerses me in his stories as good as anybody else that I've ever read. So Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World might be a way for you to get immersed into some Haruki Murakami. All right, the next author, I've read 19 books, and that's Jim Butcher. 17 of these books are in one series, so I don't feel 100% knowledgeable about the author as far as talking about different entry points. In fact, no, 18 books are within one series, 17 novels plus a short story collection. So I can't speak to this author's breadth and give you a great entry point, except for Stormfront, Book 1 of the Dresden Files. If you want to hear me talk about the Dresden Files, I did a tier ranking last month on that series. It talks about kind of the ebbs and flows of the series, how it continually gets better, because when it does get to book 12, Changes, that is my favorite book by Jim Butcher. Butcher writes, at least in the Dresden Files, some great urban fantasy. In fact, until I read the Dresden Files, I wasn't sure if urban fantasy would be something for me. And the Dresden Files just showed me that, yes, urban fantasy can be something for me. And I will continue to read more urban fantasy. The Greenbone Saga is probably my next one, and then probably the Alex Verus series after that will be the kind of the next 2 that I check out in that vein. But Jim Butcher, there's probably other things that you can enter, but I guess Stormfront is the best entry point. The other book I read was The Aeronaut's Windlass, which is kind of a don't want to say traditional fantasy, but is more of a fantasy tale. I know he has a Codex Alera series that a lot of people love. So, hey, since I feel the least knowledgeable about this author's breadth, if you've read Jim Butcher, tell me what your entry point for this author is in the comments section below. All right, the next author, I've read 22 books, and that's Robert Jordan. You see the Wheel of Time up here. So the Wheel of Time is 15 of those 22. It's a 14-book series with a prequel novella. The last 3 books were co-written kind of with Brandon Sanderson after Jordan's passing, but much like Tolkien, because so much of the writing is Jordan's, I do include all 3 of those books into his total as well as Sanderson's total. So Jordan, I've read 22, so those are the 15. The other 7, I read 6 of his stories, which follow Conan the Barbarian, which were published by Tor in the 80s, and then his debut novel, The Warrior of the Altai. Those books are very sword and sorcery. Wheel of Time is very epic fantasy that is steeped in tradition but is also looking forward. It starts off very much in the Eye of the World, the first book of the Wheel of Time. It starts off very much like Tolkien and a lot of the Tolkien derivative type of fantasy that was mainly championed in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And then it goes its own direction. It has a greater focus on magic. It really delves into culture. It gives you some huge character arcs. Now, Jordan does have his detractors. He can be a bit repetitive, and he can be a bit long-winded. The middle of the Wheel of Time is case in point for that. There's 4 books people call the slog. Well, I still love Jordan, and Jordan has a very important part in my reading journey because I hadn't read a lot of fantasy for a span of about 18 years, and Jordan brought me back to making this my favorite genre again. So because of that, I'll always love Robert Jordan's works. I do have 1 more book of his that I plan on reading. I haven't read 1 more of the Conan novels, so that total will at least get to 23 before I'm probably done with Robert Jordan, because I don't know if I want to read his. He wrote under a pseudonym, kind of some romance novels. I don't think I'll go that way. But my favorite by Robert Jordan, of course, is The Wheel of Time in its entirety. My favorite book of his would be Knife of Dreams, which is the 11th book of the series. But the entry point for Jordan, it has to be The Eye of the World. If you're not daunted by a huge, long series, that's the place to start for Robert Jordan. All right, down to my top 4. 4th is Brandon Sanderson at, I have to check my notes, see how many books. 25 books by Sanderson. So actually, he's tied with 3rd for this one. So Sanderson is one of the most famous modern fantasy authors. One of his things that is notable is his hard magic systems. I think he even coined the term magic system, where there are rules, and he always tells you about the rules, sometimes ad nauseum to be perfectly clear, but he's such an imaginative author. His imagination is fantastic. His world building is some of my favorite in the genre because it's just so inventive and so different and so unique. It doesn't feel like a lot of other things. You know, there's so much in the fantasy genre that feels, this is European-inspired medieval fantasy, or this is Eastern inspired. Well, Sanderson just feels different for the most part. So I've always loved that about his works. I've read just about everything in the Cosmere. I'm pretty caught up there, and that's kind of the extent of what I've read with Sanderson. I guess the only non-Cosmere thing I've read is The Frugal Wizard's Guide to Surviving Medieval England, which I can never say that fast for some reason. So Sanderson, I would say my favorite is actually the novella The Emperor's Soul. I think that is just perfect. He didn't have time to get bloated or get repetitive or to over-explain things, and I think it's just a perfect little novella. You can find it by itself or in the collection Arcanum Unbounded, which is a good selection of short fiction within the Cosmere. So I love The Emperor's Soul. I think the best entry point for Brandon Sanderson is Mistborn, or Mistborn: The Final Empire, however you see it published. It's the first book of the Mistborn trilogy, but it actually can function as a standalone because the story has a full narrative arc that ends very satisfactorily at the end, and I think is a great entry point to Sanderson. In many ways, the Mistborn series is still some of my favorite things that I've read by Sanderson. Love the magic system, love the characters, and I do think it's probably still the best entry point, in my opinion, to the works of Brandon Sanderson. So also tied for 3rd would be Robin Hobb, who is also written as Megan Lindholm, both of which are pseudonyms, if you didn't know that. But Hobb's works, you see them prominently displayed here. I even have another copy of Here, the Folio Society editions of what I love, the first series, the Farseer trilogy by Hobb. Hobb is one of my favorite authors, period. The Realm of the Elderlings is my favorite book series. So I just told you my favorite by the author. Hobb writes, as Hobb, she writes very character-focused epic fantasy. And character-focused in that there are passages, like hundreds of pages in her books, where the plot really doesn't do anything, but you're getting character development and world development, and it's still fantastic. Hobb is one of the best in the genre at creating character. She also has one of the finest writing styles in the genre as well. So Hobb is a favorite because of that. She also wrote a lot of books under the name Megan Lindholm. She wrote most of her short fiction under that name, and the novels of Megan Lindholm are a lot thinner. She often says that Hobb can be a bit long-winded. And Lindholm also writes kind of some urban fantasy. She kind of has some prehistoric fantasy. She has a lot of different kinds of things in her output as well. So what I've read of Hobb is all of the Realm of the Elderlings, plus I've read The Wolf's Brother, those two books, Wizard of the Pigeons, The Gypsy. I think that's all the ones that I've read. Oh, and the three books of Soldier Sun series. So that gets me up to the 23 books. I have a few more to do. I'm going to do the Key and Vendian quartet next year, and then I think all I'll have left is her sci-fi novel, Alien Earth. So I'm almost at the end of being caught up with Hobb/Lindholm. My favorite, I already told you, is The Realm of the Elderlings. If I had to pick a sub-series within The Realm of the Elderlings, I would probably pick the Fitz and the Fool trilogy, and if I were to pick my favorite book within The Realm of the Elderlings, it would be the final book, Assassin's Fate, which is one of my favorite books of all time. For an entry point, I think Assassin's Apprentice, the first book of the Farseer trilogy, the first book of the Realm of the Elderlings, is the best place to first read Robin Hobb. All right, the gap between third and second is a bit of a gap because we go above 40. I think my count for Michael Connelly is 44 books. That includes some of the things that are only on ebook. Michael Connelly writes crime fiction, and he is my favorite in the genre. He's one of my favorite authors of all time, obviously, if I've read more than 40 books by him. He writes a lot of his books are basically standalones. There is somewhat of a through narrative throughout his books just because there are characters in common. He has his Lincoln Lawyer novels, like 8 or 10 of those. He has about 20 Harry Bosch books, LAPD Detective. But his books do function as a standalone. And in fact, when I started reading Connelly, I read about 4 or 5 of them just totally all over the place until I realized, hey, all of those were great. I'm going to read everything and start at the beginning. So I started back at the beginning and read through everything in that way. So Connelly's Mr. Consistent. And the thing that I always say about him and with his consistency is his ceiling may not be as high as some other authors that I've read, but his floor is higher than anybody else's. Like the worst book that Connelly can write is like a 7 out of 10. He's just Mr. Consistent. My favorite work of Connelly's is a book called The Poets, which follows a journalist. So it's not one of the Bosch or Haller books. And it's a journalist trying to catch a serial killer. It's really good. That's my favorite. My entry point, honestly, is you can start anywhere. Whenever someone wants a concrete recommendation individually, I'll give it to them. But you can start anywhere with Connelly. So you can just read the back or the inside flaps of a book. If it sounds appealing to you, pick it up. But if you want a concrete entry point, I gave one to my friend Brian Bell a couple weeks ago, of The Last Coyote, which is the 4th Bosch book. And although you miss a little bit of character development in those first 3 books, it's the first really, really good Connelly book. So if I have to pick one, I'm going to pick The Last Coyote by Michael Connelly. Okay, number 1, not a surprise, Stephen King. I have no idea what the count is. It's above 80. It's tough because do the Bachman books count as 1? Do they count as 4? I mean, it's hard to keep track of King. I've read basically everything by King. There's a couple nonfiction books that I haven't read, but pretty much everything I have read by him. King is, if you don't know King, you probably know King, just like Tolkien. If you don't know King, I'm shocked. But King writes in a wide variety of genres. I have another video to just recommend. It's my Stephen King Reader's Guide, where I break down all of his books by genre. I have the horror books, I have the magical realism books, I have the crime fiction books, the nonfiction, the short fiction, all of that. So all of those categories also give short lists. So like here's 4 or 5 horror books that I really recommend. And then I do try to recommend one entry point. The thing with King is he's just a great storyteller, and that's what I love about his works. I've been reading a lot of his short fiction lately, and I just love how inventive and different his stories are often. He can often be just telling a lot of horror stories, but they can be very, very different kind of horror stories. And then he can just slip into kind of a slice of life, coming of age tale. And I just love him as a storyteller, and that's why I keep going back to King. Now, to contrast him with Connolly that I just talked about, King's ceiling is sky high, but his floor is pretty low. He's got some stinkers in there. I admit that as one of my favorite authors. I consider him my second favorite author after Guy Gavriel Kay. He's got some bad books in there. There's no denying that. So King is a bit inconsistent, but when King's great, there's few better. So my favorite work by Stephen King is the novel 11/22/63, which is time travel. A man goes back in time to stop the Kennedy assassination. It's my favorite work of King's. For an entry point, this changes for me about every 6 months. Right now, I'm going to say my entry point for Stephen King is the short fiction collection Night Shift. I reread that last year, and it just blew me away. It was so good. Like, every single story just about was great, and it showed a lot of diversity within his writing, and I think it's a great entry point to see if you like kind of the way that King tells his stories. And it's smaller, digestible chunks. Anyway, I think I'm going to pick Night Shift as my entry point for Stephen King. So, hey, those are the authors I've read most. I'd love to hear who your most read authors are. Put those in the comment section below. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. You can also find me on Twitter, Goodreads, and the Fireside Discord. I'd love to interact with you there. As always, thank you for watching. Till next time, goodbye.